All right, Miss Henderson. Today I wanted to meet with you to talk about the observation from about a couple of weeks ago, in which you were doing a lesson and you were wanting to, in that lesson, you were wanting to incorporate some opportunities for your students to do a lot more higher order thinking, using their skills, encouraging them to. One thing that you talked about in the pre-conference that we had was getting away from that memorization and to really push them to use multiple processes. Ask why, how do you know that? You know, increase those questions in your classroom. And so today, I wanted to follow up with you and talk about the lesson, get your feelings about the lesson, things that you felt were good, things that you felt like maybe we still need to look at some opportunities for growth. Honestly, I was just very impressed that day. The kids were very engaged. They were with you the whole time. I mean, the whole entire classroom was just, I mean, it was just amazing. It really was. And I feel like the things you wanted me to look for, I feel like you got to those levels and you reached those levels. So, one of the first questions I want to ask you is what were your feelings as far as how you felt the lesson went, as far as your expectations were concerned? Did the students reach those levels? Did they reach your expectations? So, tell me what your feelings were concerning that day.
I feel like the students did an excellent job. My big issue that I think that I struggle with is there are times where I overplan or assume that I can get more done in the time that I can, or anticipate that the students. Sometimes I struggle to anticipate the students will struggle with something, or they won't struggle with it, or back and forth. So I think that I planned for them to be able to go in the hallway and to do all this, and I realized in my first class that didn't happen with them, but they're a different class, so I thought maybe it would happen with third period. And so I would say that with probably a downfall is the over planning, or I guess just not being aware that they would take a longer time understanding the concept for us to be able to get out into the hallway. But I think that the students did achieve my learning objective for that day. I think that they were able to tell me what a verb mood was, the different types, and to even be able to write verb moods or sentences in different verb moods in a higher order thinking fashion versus just identifying them in sentences.
Let me ask you this. Do you feel like, well, first of all, my observation that day, the transition from each activity was flawless. I feel like they were with you. And when I say with you, they were making connections. The connection that I saw that just blew me away, which to me is, again, hitting those higher order thinking skills, was the fact that when you talked about all the different types of sentences you guys had studied before this, and then you brought in the verb moods, seeing the connection between, interrogative, declarative, and all that kind of stuff, and then connecting it to the verb moods and things like that was just amazing to me. But I thought your transitions were flawless. Um, you mentioned about not being able to go outside. You had your pictures outside.
Yes.
But do you think that was a hindrance to the lesson? I mean, I felt like regardless of you having to go out in the hallway, the kids still got what they needed. So do you think that was a
No, I think that sometimes going out into the hallway and doing things allows them to get up and move around and add a different dynamic to the classroom versus just sitting and doing. However, I don't feel like it took away from the lesson in the classroom. The way that I was able to modify it to where I put the pictures up, they wrote, and then they could talk with their table, allowed them to even go further because in the hallway they would have been doing it individually and then coming back to talk. So allowing them to do it one by one allowed for me to better remediate the students. And if they didn't understand something, instead of waiting until the whole activity was done, I could do it picture by picture. Right. So in a way, it was better. It was kind of give and take. I lost the chance to allow them to get up and move around, but gained the ability to add remediation immediately when it was needed.
Gotcha. Another question I want to ask you: when the students were working in groups and they were able to depend on each other, do you feel like the responses you were getting from the individuals in the group were more individual responses versus listen to the rest of the feedback in the group and I kind of went with what they said? Do you think that was, because you did a lot of informal assessment throughout the lesson. So I guess what I'm trying to say is when you were doing those informal assessments, were you really gaining insight to what that individual student really knew at that time and was really using that higher order thinking skill? Or do you feel like you were gaining insight into what the group knew? Does that make sense?
Yes.
And if it doesn't,
I think there are
clarify.
moments where it might have been the group, like the sorting activity. It was easy for one person to dominate and to go through and to organize. But I think by assigning a role of a facilitator, someone to help things, that with their part of that role was making sure that everyone was involved. And I think as little as that was, I think it made a difference. In the sorting activity, they, assigned you do this, and so that one could have been closer to a whole group, but a lot of the individual sentence writing, I was able to monitor and check. And so I think that was, there were times where it could have been more group-based, but I think there was enough in there that was individual-based that I could tell whether or not a student had it or they did.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Would you do anything different?
I think that I probably would.
Mr. Kevin Beck, if you would, could you please go to Miss Veal's room, please? Thank you.
If I had done things differently, I maybe would have shortened the lesson a little bit, or taken out as much. I think the pictures in between and like the little writing their own sentences was helpful, but maybe having some of it already filled in the chart, because it did take longer than I anticipated for them to actually fill in the chart and go through the notes, which always how it happens, because you anticipate them learning faster than they do, and you have to modify for them. But I feel like if maybe next year I might take that chart and maybe fill in one column, so they only have to do, instead of doing the meaning, the hashtag, and their own sentence, just having the meaning filled in, and they do the hashtag and writing their own sentence, something like that, to speed up the process, because student writing can sometimes take an extra amount of time.
Would you say that your students reached the level you wanted them to?
I would say that. I think that they were able to not only identify different verb moods, but also write sentences in those verb moods and justify why those verb moods why their sentences were in those verb moods versus another one.
Right. How did they do? Because when I got to the end of the lesson, of course, you've given them the assignment, the pictures, and then you had a certain type of verb mood. They had to write a sentence that reflected that mood. How did they do on that assignment?
They did very well. They still struggled with subjunctive verb mood.
Okay. Which was one of the more challenging ones.
Because a subjunctive verb mood could be a wish, suggestion, recommendation, imaginary situation. I want them to lean towards imaginary situation, but wish is so easy that when I looked back at their papers, many of them for the subjunctive just put, I wish something, I wish, and then something to do with that picture. And so we had to do more work with subjunctive and conditional. I incorporated it the next weekend after Thanksgiving. I incorporated it into my warm-ups. What's the difference between conditional and subjunctive? And we discussed it, and we ended up going through more examples, and they took an assessment over verb moods and did fairly well.
Good then. Well, what was kind of your, not necessarily your aha moment during that lesson, but what was maybe a clear signal to you that, I'm feeling good about this. I really feel like they're on a roll. They're with me. I know that I'm reaching, they're reaching those levels of higher order thinking that I want them to. So what was, I guess, kind of like your aha moment? Like what was something to celebrate that day in that lesson? What was something that just really made you proud that day? Of course, if you can remember back to
yes, I know. Just like their eagerness, and also just I think of the student that was over there and his frustration, but he was thinking, and I think that it's exciting because sometimes eighth graders don't want to think, and so actually like seeing their thought process and like actually trying, and also having after the lesson doing the sorting activity, seeing them like, no, it's this because of this, and being able to
seeing them kind of argue constructively with each other,
like trying to figure it out and not being like, well, I don't know this, but actually like, well, it's this, and looking back at their notes, and I think actually seeing them going back to their notes and talking through it versus just putting them in areas
Right.
was a moment that I was like, they got this. They listened earlier and now can apply, which is what any teacher
Right.
wants their students to be able to.
What did you think about the student that sat back here? I don't know if you remember.
Yes.
And what did you think about, he's not a student that to me takes a lot of chances.
Yes.
And if I remember correctly, he took a chance that day by going with his own, answer
versus.
and not being convinced by the rest of them that, oh, you need to go with us. Well, what did you think about that? Because knowing that he does struggle to some degree, did you feel like that was he really could give you justification for that answer that day? Do you really feel like he had it, or do you think he was?
Oh, I think he had it, and I think that I thought it was just a really cool moment because he actually thought he was wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But he had the right thought process,
Mm-hmm.
but he just assumed
Mm-hmm.
everyone else was wrong, and I asked on him because he was the only one in the room that was right, and
Right.
so he didn't, I don't think, expect it to be
Uh-huh.
right, and I think he understood it because he went off of what he knew,
Right.
and
He was pretty passionate about it too. That
yeah,
day.
he was, but he
Mhm.
also was like, when I told him he was right, he was like, what? Like, he just couldn't
Yeah.
believe that he had done it, and
Right.
I think he understood it, and it's interesting how time affects their minds because, a few days later when we talked about it again, they seemed to struggle a little bit more, but they could remember what they did learn,
Right.
and I think he remembered, he mentioned it, and a few days later he was
Uh-huh.
like, well, I got that answer right, and
Uh-huh.
and I think that it did affect, and I think
How did he do with his sentences though? Like, how did he do later?
He was
Maybe still was challenged by the same.
I think he was still pretty typical, and I think just creating sentences sometimes can be difficult for them, and so his sentences were correct, but they were
maybe not to the extent that somebody else.
Yes.
I want to just kind of going back through my notes, and I wanted to maybe kind of point out some things that I just was very impressed with from the students, if I can find what I was looking for. There was one student that sat back this way, and he made a connection. Oh my goodness, I wish I could remember. I'm pretty sure I wrote it down. Let's see. Miss Henderson, I'm letting you down. I don't know if it had to do with tone.
It was, yes, he,
Is it?
I'm trying to remember exactly what they said. Oh, but we,
I know I wrote it down.
it was with the definition of verb mood because it was the mood of the
Did it have
author, which is the same definition as
tone? That's right. What was your feelings on his response that day?
I thought it was really cool because we had just talked about it the week, like literally maybe 3 or 4 days before, so that they were able to make that connection was really a cool thing. It tells me that they are remembering not just what I'm teaching, but they're sinking in.
But do you feel like that's the biggest sign of they've reached a level of higher order thinking that I wanted them to reach?
I definitely think so because that's a reading concept that they're matching with a grammar concept, and I think.
And you were not probing them?
No, that was just.
It was just like, there was so many connections, and I think you and I talked about it informally after it was over with. There was just so many connections that were made that class period to previously taught skills, connecting them to the present skill you were working on, and then taking that thinking to just they took a lot of chances that day. They were not scared to be wrong. Now this one back here was rode the fence a little bit as far as didn't want to be embarrassed and things like that, but they were very willing to take a chance, and in my mind that is a total sign of engagement. I'm in this. I want to express my opinion, and I want to express my sentence, and I want to see, because there were some great sentences that were made. There were just, in my opinion, it was just a fantastic lesson. I was so impressed with even going back to simple things that are beyond the higher order thinking that you really wanted to get to that day. But you gave them a couple of example sentences when you were going over what each mood was, and you allowed them to pick one of the example sentences that they felt like probably was easier for them instead of making them write down all three of them. Then, of course, moving into the creation of the sentences. A lot of times when it comes to grammar, we're guilty of, and you may not agree, but guilty of giving them the sentence.
Oh, yes.
Always giving them the sentence. And then saying, okay, what verb mood does this sentence reflect? Well, that doesn't allow them to put any personal touches on it and really necessarily show you that they do understand the concept. I mean, you gave them the pictures and then just allowed them time to just, come up with their own and put their own personal touches. I mean, I was just really amazed at it, and I was very impressed. And I was so impressed, and you've heard me say this several times again, just the connections that were made. I mean, it was just, that lesson just flowed, and it just moved from one thing to the next. I think the time, even though you feel like you may not had enough time, I feel like you capitalized on everything you had planned that day in that lesson. But a couple of things I just want to get your opinion on as far as some things that, maybe some suggestions. When you were doing the group work, and they were, well, I say the group work, when they were doing the sentence sort, and you were the only one that had to pop around each group to check the sentences. What is something you think that maybe next time if you do something like that, what could maybe save you a little time?
Probably having like them printed out. And I did plan to do that, and I didn't get a chance to. And I didn't even realize that would be an issue until the period you're in, because the period before, I have 2 other teachers in there.
True.
So I didn't even have a second thought about, doing that until that period. I thought, oh, I've got to get around to all these groups. And so that's when I pulled a student from another group. But that could even be problematic because she could forget what the correct answers are. Right. So in the future, I would probably print it out
or if you had it, taped around the room somewhere. They can get up, the facilitator or the leader, whatever the job description was, they could get up and go check on it. When you walked around and you checked the sentence sort, do you feel like you asked enough questions that allowed them to justify what they were doing? Because I know sometimes when you do group work and you have to go by and check something, you get caught up in the just checking to see if it's right or wrong.
And I would say I probably did that.
Okay.
It was probably about 2 groups in that I felt the pressure of, I've got to get it all these
and
groups.
You're probably and I've checked.
Yes, I've checked. Or I'm just trying to be very mindful to keep my students on task.
Right.
And having them have something to do. And so I was just thinking, well, this group's been done for a few minutes, and now this other group is still struggling and trying to manage the time. I probably was more focused on making sure that I got through everybody versus actually slowing down. I did ask some questions whenever the students were struggling, like if they had one wrong, I'd say, well, what is subjunctive? Like reminding them of that. But I feel like I probably should have slowed that down, and I could have if I had printed out the answer key and had it somewhere for the students to check.
I got you. Well, like I said, I think, the sort was great. It really was. And it was a simple, slow way to move them into what they were about to have to create later on by the pictures. But those were just some suggestions, some things I wrote down. I said maybe post the keys in the room so that the kids could ask or check on their own. And then, as you facilitate, ask them to give you more justification, more why, how, that kind of thing. Just trying to see if there was any other. Overall, A++, is that what you give yourself?
Is that what I would give myself?
Yeah.
I would say A+. I think that I did well, but I think that it was probably a strong lesson. I try to be realistic. There are moments, like I think that the sorting issue with not having the key would take off some points, and not being able to fulfill my exact lesson plan takes off a few points, So I would, I don't know, maybe an A. But I think that I grade or level my success on a lesson on how well the students do, and I felt like every period by the end of the day that they had a good understanding of verb moods and that they were confident in their learning. And I think that so often with grammar, they don't feel that.
Mhm.
And so I feel like it was a success because the students were confident and sure of what they did.
And then of course your attitude just filters to them and just
Yes.
gives them this, I don't know, this feeling of just, I think kids feel really comfortable in your room making mistakes, sharing wrong answers, because you're not going to degrade them for giving you a wrong answer. You're going to guide them and direct them to the correct answer. And that's one thing that I feel like you are very strong as far as, a quality you have. It's a very strong quality. Um, Again, I appreciate you allowing me to come into your room. I've seen many of your lessons. I would rank this one as one of your top lessons. You could definitely tell that the research was there. You could definitely tell that you had done your homework. Your instructional planning process was, it was, you couldn't walk in and just shoot by the side of your hip. You knew that there was a lot of planning that had gone into that lesson, and I appreciate that. I think the kids appreciate that. And language arts is one of those subjects where you have to put a lot of time and
Yes.
effort into the planning. But again, I appreciate you allowing me to come and be a part of your classroom as always. I do feel like you reached the level that you were looking for. Your kids reached the level that you were looking for, and I just encourage you to continue to take chances and continue to try new things. So, thank you.
Thank you.